He didn't inherit a crown, he invaded a throne, and then the beds of his own allies. John I wasn't remembered for victories, but for scandals. While other kings used rings to seal alliances, he used threats to take married women. The throne became a stage for his desires, and his authority a license to defile what was sacred. No one chose him, no one wanted him. But when the unexpected handed him power, the kingdom discovered that worse than a tyrant is a small man with absolute authority. A king who didn't just steal land, he stole wives, and left an entire empire bleeding in his wake. And if you, like me, believe that some stories haven't been told the right way, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. I always read them. John was born in the wrong place in line and at the wrong time in the dynasty. The youngest son of Henry II and brother to legends like Richard the Lionheart, he was the leftover of a glorious generation. Those closest to him saw him as useless. Those farther away ignored him. While still alive, his father gave him a nickname that would echo through the centuries: Lackland. It wasn't just about land, it was about significance. While his brothers received castles, armies, and glory in battle, John got silence and contempt. He grew up in a world built on conquest, but nothing belonged to him. And it's in this emotional and political void that the real John was formed. Resentful, deceitful, obsessed with control. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be feared. He wanted the same nobles who once dismissed him to kneel, not out of loyalty, but out of terror. And he would do whatever it took to make that happen. You cannot understand John's actions without understanding the wound that shaped him. Rejection, combined with unchecked power, didn't produce a king. It created a predator. When he finally took the throne in 1199, he didn't transform. He simply removed the mask. The boy who had been ignored now had an army. The forgotten brother now held a signet ring. And so began a legacy marked by blackmail, betrayal, and invasions, not only of territory, but of homes, marriages, and lives. The forgotten boy now commanded an army. The ignored brother now wore the royal seal. But the most dangerous part was still to come. John Mern didn't just want to reign, he wanted to possess. And his first act as king made that very clear. Less than a year after his coronation, he annulled his own marriage. Isabella of Gloucester, his politically convenient wife, was discarded under the claim that they were cousins, and thus their union was invalid. A detail conveniently overlooked for years until the moment she became useless. In her place, John chose another, Isabella, younger, more beautiful, and above all, more useful. Isabella of Angoulême was only 12 years old when she was ripped away from her engagement to Hugh X of Lusignan, one of the most powerful barons in Poitou. The wedding had already been arranged, the rings prepared. But for John, his desire for her, and for the lands that came with her, spoke louder. With political coldness and personal brutality, he simply took what he wanted. A king with power, a man without limits. To the world, it was a scandalous gesture. A 33-year-old king claiming a child bride already promised to another man. To the French court, it was an insult. To England, it was the beginning of a reign without restraint. But to John, it was just the beginning. What seemed like a strategic move quickly revealed something darker. He wasn't just after alliances. He wanted total control, even over bodies and wills. His union with Isabella didn't just spark war with the Lusignans. It exposed a pattern that would define his rule, taking women like conquering fortresses, without consent, without shame, without return. John's shift wasn't a moment. It was a decision. Now king, he would no longer pretend to have limits. He would use the crown as a shield and his desire as a sword. And from that point on, scandals were no longer whispered rumors. They became state policy. The fire John lit against the Braos family didn't stop at threats. When Matilda confronted him in public, refusing to hand over her own son as a hostage, she didn't just wound a king's ego, she violated the only law that still ruled his heart, the law of absolute obedience. Matilda's words echoed through the castle halls like a prophecy of blood. "I will not trust my children to a man who killed his own nephew." It was a direct accusation, a dangerous truth, and above all, a death sentence. Not for someone else, but upon herself. John reacted as he always did when exposed, with brutality. He declared William de Braos a traitor, seized his property, and ordered his capture. But Matilda was the real target. The woman who dared to say no would be destroyed. Not quickly, but cruelly. Captured with her son, Matilda was sent to prison in Corfe Castle. No trial, no defense, only silence, cold, and darkness. Locked in an underground cell without water, without food, without even a candle, she waited for help, for forgiveness, for death. 11 days later, the guards opened the door and found what was left of humanity in the depths of a castle, a mother dead, her head resting on her son's chest. What shocked them wasn't the position of the bodies. It was what they saw on the boy's face, bite marks. In the most primal desperation, Matilda had tried to keep her son alive with her own body. It was the end of a woman and the beginning of a rebellion. The impact of that barbaric act wasn't confined to the damp stones of the cell. It crossed the kingdom's borders, reaching the ears of nobles, bishops, and soldiers. If even the wife of one of the greatest barons wasn't safe, who was? Justice wouldn't come from the courts. There was no longer any law that could restrain a king who used prison as a personal punishment. But in that moment, the court realized John had gone too far. This was no longer a war over land. It was a war over limits. And the response wouldn't come in words. It was being drafted in secret, clause by clause, by outraged hands. There was something about Matilda's death that even time couldn't bury. It wasn't just the bones discovered in that cell, but what they silently conveyed. That woman wasn't just the wife of a baron, mother of an heir, lady of castles. She was the symbol of a scream no one dared to voice, a cry of resistance against a merciless king. The image of their two bodies embraced spread through the kingdom like an open wound. Those who saw it never forgot. Those who heard the story never forgave. For the first time, whispers of fear gave way to murmurs of indignation. Something had changed. A boundary had been crossed. It was no longer about John taking wives or abusing power. It was about the very real possibility that no one, absolutely no one, was safe. Not the wealthiest, not the most loyal, not even the quietest. The castle that was meant to protect had become a tomb, and the throne a death sentence. In taverns, monks began recording the event in manuscripts. In markets, minstrels turned the tragedy into forbidden song. In secret councils, nobles discussed the unthinkable, forcing a king to answer for his actions. Something unprecedented, something unimaginable, something until then that had only lived in fantasy. The grief over Matilda's death did not end in mourning. It turned into organized rage. Her story became the spark of a greater fire. If her body had been buried in haste, her memory had not. It became a banner, a cause, a reason. And that's when John realized, far too late, that absolute power comes with a high price. When even those who once bowed begin to rise, the throne becomes a minefield. Every step, a betrayal. Every decree, a rupture. And in silence, the kingdom was preparing its response. Matilda died in the dark, but she reignited the light of outrage. From her death on, fear changed sides. For the first time, the king himself was the hunted. And though the crown still gleamed on his head, the blood on his hands dimmed any gold. Matilda de Braos died in darkness, but her name set the kingdom ablaze. The horror of her death didn't stop at the walls of Corfe Castle. It crossed borders, council tables, and distant castle hearths. For the first time, it wasn't just the people murmuring, it was the barons themselves asking, "What if it were my wife? What if it were my child?" The fear that once silenced now began to make people speak, and each whispered word became a spark in dry powder. John hadn't just crossed moral lines, he had broken the unwritten contract between king and vassals, one of mutual protection and honor. He was no longer seen as a ruler, but as a predator armed with a crown. The accumulated anger took form. Barons, once divided by rivalry, united around a common cause: to stop the king. Secret meetings began to take place. Oaths were broken. Castles began to prepare, not for foreign war, but for battle against their own sovereign. John, blinded by pride, didn't see that he was digging his own downfall with every impulsive act. Between 1213 and 1215, the tension erupted. The barons demanded change. They demanded limits. They wanted the king to yield not out of submission, but out of justice. John tried to buy time. He promised to listen, but it was too late. England was no longer silent. The throne, already cracked, began to tremble. In June of 1215, surrounded by his own former allies now armed against him, John was forced to sign a document that, until then, would have been considered royal heresy: the Magna Carta. Written on the banks of the River Thames at Runnymede, this parchment changed the fate of the English monarchy and the political history of the West. The Charter established, among other clauses, that the king could not imprison, exile, or punish any free man without a fair trial. For the first time, royal power was no longer absolute, it was subject to the law. It marked the beginning of the end for the divine image of royalty, and it all began with the death of a woman who dared to say no. John signed but never accepted. He tried to revoke it, threatened, appealed to the Pope, but the damage was done. His abuses had birthed a document, his tyranny a limit, and from that point forward no one, not even a king, would stand above justice. The signing of the Magna Carta didn't redeem King John. On the contrary, it exposed his weakness. The king who once ruled with an iron fist was now seen as a cornered man without trusted allies, feared not for his authority, but for his instability. His image, already stained by scandal, crumbled completely. The halls of the court, once places of flattery, became silent corridors of suspicion. Smiles at the table vanished. Nobles avoided meeting with him behind closed doors. Even his advisers knew a compliment taken the wrong way could lead to punishment. A glance held too long could cost one their land or their wife. John's shadow no longer symbolized majesty, but threat. The women of the court, once trained to smile before the king, now walked accompanied by maids and guards. They knew what a private invitation could mean. Rumors spread that John kept private dungeons in remote fortresses, and no one dared to confirm or deny. It was safer to pretend they didn't know. Monks quietly recorded episodes of infidelity, abuse, and illegitimate children born of coerced women. They said the king had offspring scattered across England, but few dared acknowledge them. Not out of shame, but out of fear they'd be used as currency in his unstable alliances. The throne, in the eyes of the people, had become a dark stage, where the plot was always the same: betrayal, lust, and downfall. Even the church, which for centuries had legitimized kings as God's chosen, began to withdraw. John had been excommunicated years earlier for defying the Pope, and though he sought reconciliation to secure his political position, the spiritual stain never faded. Priests whispered in Latin that the man was possessed, and many believed it. After all, who else could commit such horror? Among the soldiers, loyalty was no longer ideological. It was paid for, and poorly. Desertions increased. Neighboring kingdoms smelled weakness. And within the realm, John began to be compared to foreign tyrants, pagan kings, even decadent Roman emperors. His name, which should have commanded respect, now provoked nervous laughter or awkward silence. John was no longer a king among men. He was a burden on England, and everyone knew that as long as he lived, the kingdom would remain under threat. The throne was no longer a symbol of stability. It had become a reminder that sometimes the enemy doesn't come from outside, but is born within the castle. When a king loses respect, he tries to maintain control through fear, and when fear is no longer enough, power becomes currency, and people, merchandise. John the Fine understood this better than anyone. With his authority eroded and alliances broken, he began to trade the only thing he had left, the women he himself used and discarded. Throughout his reign, John collected lovers. Some came from noble families, others were captured or coerced. But none of them seemed to have a choice. Many were kept secret, others paraded like trophies at private feasts. There was no romance, only domination. And when his interest faded, their fate was even crueler. They were forced to marry the king's trusted men as a form of reward or political blackmail. Chronicles from the time tell of one unnamed mistress who, after years with John, was handed over to a nobleman in exchange for military support. The man agreed, but had to pay 20,000 marks to the king to make the marriage official. The price wasn't for her dowry. It was for her past, for the fact that she had once belonged to the king. That's how John treated the female body, as an extension of the throne. If he couldn't use the sword to forge alliances, he used the wombs of the women he took. He stitched agreements with flesh, not with parchment, and the men who accepted this kind of royal gift did so out of ambition or fear, never out of honor. Isabella, his official queen, was one of the few who resisted. But even she had to watch, powerless, as her status was degraded. While John scattered bastards across the kingdom, she was kept as throne decoration, ignored in public, replaced in private. The woman once used to unite kingdoms became a prisoner of a castle without respect. In the eyes of history, this practice was more than cruelty. It was systematic, a cycle of taking, discarding, and redistributing women that reflected the inner chaos of his reign. The king who stole wives began to hand out lovers like sacks of grain. And with every woman traded, with every forced alliance, John dug himself deeper into his own downfall. It was no longer enough to be hated as a king. He was now despised as a man. In a time when kings were crowned under blessings and divine fear, losing the support of the church was more than a political crisis. It was a sentence of eternal isolation. And John the Fire, already hated by his barons and feared by his victims, made his final mistake. He defied the altar. It all began as an administrative dispute, like so many others during his reign. The Archbishopric of Canterbury, the highest ecclesiastical post in England, was vacant. Pope Innocent III appointed Stephen Langton, a learned, firm, and independent man. But John, obsessed with control, refused to accept him. He wanted a compliant bishop, not a servant of Rome. His refusal was not merely a personal insult. It was seen as a direct challenge to papal authority. The Pope responded like a true spiritual sovereign, not with armies, but with silence. In 1208, Innocent III placed an interdict over all of England. Churches were closed, masses suspended, bells went silent, marriages and funerals ceased to be celebrated. For 6 years the English lived in religious emptiness, all because of their king. The rupture with the church turned John into a spiritual outcast. In 1209, the punishment escalated. He was officially excommunicated. That meant he was no longer just a bad king, he was considered an enemy of God. No sacrament could be performed in his presence. No priest could advise him. No dead could be buried legitimately under his reign. The entire kingdom plunged into spiritual collapse. In the villages, the faithful feared they were condemned along with the king. In cathedrals, John's name was removed from prayers. In some places, monks went so far as to erase his coat of arms from liturgical books and religious murals. And in noble castles, this divine distancing was the final signal. If even God had turned against the monarch, why should they remain loyal? The pressure was unbearable. Fear of a French invasion backed by the Pope grew. The throne was vulnerable from within and without. And then, in the most humiliating act of his life, John surrendered. In 1213, he officially handed over the Kingdom of England and Ireland as papal property. He became, in the eyes of Christendom, a vassal of the Pope. In exchange, his excommunication was lifted. But the political cost was devastating. The crown, once a symbol of English sovereignty, now looked like a leash. The nobles despised him more than ever. The people, scandalized, whispered that the king had sold the country. Even his reconciliation with the church, though effective on paper, never restored his image among the religious. To many, John had already crossed the line separating heretic from possessed. And the worst part, all this submission didn't come from repentance. It came from fear. Fear of losing the throne, fear of invasion, fear of being completely alone. Faith didn't change him. It only humiliated him, and while he pretended devotion to save his reign, his enemies only multiplied. If once John was seen as a cruel king, now he was seen as weak. If once he was a wolf, now he was a dog leashed to roam. And in a world where authority came both from heaven and from the sword, he had neither. When John Mai was stripped of spiritual authority, all he had left was his ability to wage war. And even that began to fail. The king, who once used fear as a weapon, now saw the kingdom slipping through his fingers. And the battlefield, once a stage of glory for his ancestors, became the site of his ultimate disgrace. The loss of French territories wasn't a single event, it was a slow and humiliating bleed. Ever since he forcibly took Isabella of Angoulême, who was promised to the powerful Hugh X of Lusignan, John had stirred the fury of great noble houses in western France. It didn't take long for King Philip II of France to seize the opportunity, gathering allies and launching a devastating offensive against England's continental holdings. In 1204, Normandy, the jewel of the crown since the days of William the Conqueror, fell into Philip's hands. The news crossed the English Channel like a dagger to English pride. For the first time, lands that had belonged to England for generations were lost with no glory, no effective resistance, no honor. But John didn't back down. He tried to launch new campaigns. He squeezed even more taxes from an already impoverished people. He ordered forced levies of soldiers, but his reputation as a strategist was disastrous. His generals didn't respect him, his allies defected, and his own barons, tired of the failures, began sabotaging his plans. In 1214, the king launched an ambitious offensive to try to reclaim his lost lands. It was his last big gamble. The Battle of Bouvines, fought in July of that year, sealed his fate. Philip II crushed John's forces, and the defeat was more than military. It was symbolic. John returned to England not as a warrior, but as a fugitive from his own incompetence. And the humiliation preceded him. The few allies he still had abandoned him one by one. The promises he had made to the barons, in exchange for support, turned to smoke. And the people themselves, exploited and exhausted, no longer saw him as a legitimate king. The military losses accelerated what the church and personal scandals had already set in motion, the complete collapse of royal authority. Rebellions flared up in once loyal fiefs. Cities refused to obey his orders. The barons began to gather, not in secret anymore, but in open defiance. And John, used to ruling through fear, now became a prisoner of his own reputation. There were no more borders to defend, no allies to summon. John, the king who took women, who defied popes, who insulted nobles and looted treasuries, was now a man cornered by his own mistakes. And the crown that weighed on his head no longer shone. It was a burden of iron, ready to fall. He had lost Normandy, then Anjou, then Maine, then Touraine. He lost allies, he lost soldiers, he even lost the trust of the mercenaries he hired. And with no respect from men and no favor from God, all he had left was to wait for the end to catch up with him. The end of a king should be marked by mourning, prayer, and respect. But when John I died, there was no solemn procession, no genuine tears. What there was relief, not from peace attained, but from the end of a storm that had devastated England for nearly 2 decades. It was October 1216. John, ill and on military campaign in the eastern part of the kingdom, was struck with severe dysentery. Weakened, isolated, and surrounded by only a few loyalists, he was taken to Newark Castle, where he spent his final days in physical pain, paranoia, and abandonment. The king, who once commanded armies, now groaned in a cold room, surrounded by stone walls and absence. It was said that even his servants avoided being near him, not out of reverent fear, but out of disgust. The stench of illness mixed with the weight of his reputation. No messenger brought hope, no ally came to visit, no prayers were spoken aloud. He who had been excommunicated, who mocked the altar, now died as he had lived, alone and despised. And the irony didn't stop there. His body, rejected by several abbeys, was only accepted at Worcester Cathedral after political pressure. Even in death, John was a burden. There was no agreement on how to bury him, not even on whether he deserved royal funeral rites. Many monks even wrote that his soul was beyond the reach of prayer. Matthew Paris, one of the most respected chroniclers of the time, recorded, "Hell became darker when John arrived." No other phrase so precisely captured the weight this man left behind. His final years had been a spiral of collapse. The loss of Normandy, the defeat at Bouvines, humiliation before the Pope, the forced signing of the Magna Carta, and the open rebellion of the barons. To top it off, in the final months of his life, French forces had invaded England at the invitation of the English nobles themselves. Louis, heir to the French throne, was even proclaimed king by part of the English aristocracy. John died without a unified kingdom, without glory, without peace. The man who tried to rule by fear lost everything: lands, allies, illegitimate children, respect, and finally, the throne. His successor, Henry III, was only a boy, and the weight of rebuilding what his father had destroyed would fall upon him as a cursed inheritance. The figure of Jonathan was not forgotten, but neither was it honored. Centuries later, historians still debate whether he was mad, cruel, or simply the product of a system with no moral checks. But they all agree on one thing: his death was not the end of a glorious era, but the collapse of a reign that began in scorn and ended in utter failure. The crown fell, not with a crash, but with silence. The silence of a king who stole what he wanted and died with no one wanting to remember him. The name John, he does not appear among England's heroes. He left no legendary castles, no iconic victories, no lasting peace treaties. His legacy was something else: ruin, shame, and a bitter memory. His reign is not quoted for inspiration. It is studied as a warning. For centuries, kings have come and gone. Some waged wars, others legislated, many sinned, but few dragged the throne so deep into disgrace as John did. His very existence became a living example of what happens when the crown falls into the hands of someone who neither knows nor wants to be a king. John's greatest legacy wasn't a city, nor a law he voluntarily created. It was the Magna Carta, a document he was forced to sign, a text not born of his wisdom, but of the revolt he provoked. And still, that piece of parchment today stands as one of the pillars of Western law, the principle that not even the highest power stands above justice. Ironically, John came to represent what every ruler should fear if they crossed the line: the loss of legitimacy. His abuses weren't merely moral or personal, they were structural. He destroyed alliances, turned women into trophies, forged deals through blackmail, and treated his own kingdom like inherited property, not a responsibility to be upheld. After his death, the monarchy entered a period of cautious reconstruction. His son, Henry III, ascended the throne as a boy, burdened by a tainted name. It fell to him to extinguish the fires his father had started, and it fell to the kingdom to relearn how to trust an institution nearly destroyed by the conduct of a single man. 19th-century historians nicknamed him England's worst king. More recent ones have tried to reinterpret him through psychological lenses, raising theories of childhood trauma, emotional disorders, and parental neglect. But even the most generous explanations can't redeem the facts. John ruled on impulse, punished for pleasure, and betrayed by habit. And that can't be blamed solely on the era he lived in. History portrays him as a figure of shadow, not only because of his actions, but because of the trail he left. Rulers after him began to measure their steps more carefully, not because they were saints, but because John's example stood nearby, recent and rotting, as a living warning of how far a king can fall. Today, his tomb lies in Worcester, modest, rarely visited, without fresh flowers. No one lines up to pay tribute to his memory. And perhaps that is the greatest reflection of his life, a man who held everything in his hands and failed to hold on to anything. John Nufferin was no symbol of greatness. He was the echo of a mistake, a constant reminder that the crown sanctifies no one, and that a king who rules like a predator ends as a political carcass. His legacy? It wasn't built with glory. It was left in scars, and etched into history as the example of everything a sovereign should never become. And if you've made it this far, it's because you know some stories weren't made to entertain, but to warn. On this channel we tell the real narratives that time tried to bury, and there are still many truths that need to be told. In the next video, we'll uncover another story they never taught you in school. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss it. And in the comments, tell me, what was the most shocking part of this story? I want to know how this truth impacted you. See you in the next episode, because history, the real one, isn't over yet.